Hello, everyone, and welcome to Marxist Voice, the podcast of Socialist Appeal, the British section of the International Marxist Tendency. My name is Josh Holroyd, and I'm joined tonight by Rob Sewell, editor of Socialist Appeal and the author of several books, including In the Cause of Labour, History of British Trade Unionism, and The Chartist Revolution, which he's kindly agreed to discuss with us tonight. So the book, Chartist Revolution, is coming out this Friday, and it focuses on the working class movement for the People's Charter, which we're obviously going to talk about in a moment, centered around the struggle for the vote for working class people. So the first question I wanted to ask really is, what made you want to write about this period in the 19th century, this period of working class history today in 2020? What's the relevance for today?
Well, I would say that when I began to write the book, which was a good year ago, the world economy was slowing down and there was talk of a new crisis. Of course, at the present time, we see the deepest crisis for 300 years. The working class today is faced with a terrible crisis and it'll have huge effects on living standards, on unemployment, and the general conditions of the working class. And similarly, in the early 19th century, the working class was faced with also a deep crisis in the birth pains of capitalism. As Marx explained, that capitalism came into being, dripping with blood and dirt from every pore. And these conditions gave rise to a revolutionary movement at the turn of that century, nearly 200 years ago. And I think we're entering in a similar way. We're entering a deep, profound crisis and revolutionary implications in that crisis in Britain and elsewhere. Therefore, I think it's quite relevant to deal with this situation and draw out the lessons for the working class today.
Sure. So learning about a revolutionary period in order to confront one, which I find interesting because, I mean, Chartism isn't very widely taught anyway, even here in Britain. But even when it is taught, and even in the labour movement itself, it tends not to be presented so much in the way that you just described as a revolutionary period and a revolutionary movement. Certainly, the way it's presented tends to be as a movement for the vote, as a democratic movement. I suppose you might say a civil rights movement, and perhaps you might say that there's a difference with today in that workers today do have the vote. Do you think that that's a fair characterization, or is that missing the point to an extent?
Well, of course, the Chartist movement was based on six democratic demands of the Charter, obviously. But you have to look much deeper than that and look at the context. And what strikes you really is that the histories of Chartism, the present time and even in the past, really, was either they buried Chartism or they distorted it really as some sort of portrayed it as some sort of liberal movement simply for democratic reform. Which it was not. What you have to understand was that this great movement of Chartism arose. It was the revolutionary awakening of the British working class. That's the way you have to look at it. And clearly the fight for the rights of the working class was a fight. It was a means to an end. It wasn't an end in itself. You think that the cotton workers in Lancashire or the miners in Durham were simply interesting in risking their lives and transportation and everything else simply to put a cross on a bit of paper, then you're sorely mistaken. It was always seen as a means of a better life, of the overthrow of the conditions that they faced, which were terrible conditions of capitalism in effect. And the Chartist movement was a class-conscious movement, fighting for a better life, fighting for a revolutionary change. And that's what inspired millions of workers, not simply the demands of the Charter. I think a Trowbridge Chartist put it quite quaintly when he said the Charter is not about fighting for bread, it's about roast beef, plum pudding, plenty of beer, and working 3 days a week. In other words, it was all bound up, all bound up to the social conditions of the working class, and that's the way it was seen by the mass of people.
I think what stands out for me there, and something you just said, is you have a rank and file Chartist, a Chartist worker, talking about, plum pudding, but also a 3-day week. And today, I think it was maybe 2019 this was announced, that the leadership of the TUC announced that their aim was for a 4-day working week for British workers within the next 100 years. it seems almost like we've gone backwards compared to what you just mentioned. By the way, just to clarify something, you mentioned transportation before. It might not be clear to everybody listening what that actually means. That doesn't mean simply getting the train from Manchester to London, does it?
No. I mean, the ruling class used abominable measures against the working class, which were defenseless. They tried to set up trade unions and they were banned. They tried to set up discussion circles, to discuss reform, democracy, the implications of the French Revolution, you name it. And they were banned. They made it illegal. And out of desperation, the working class, chose different means to try and forward its agenda to escape from this nightmare of capitalist crisis. And therefore, that's the reason why it had revolutionary overtones, is because of the complete impasse and the crisis that the working class faced at that time.
Mm. And it didn't come from nowhere either, because talking about a movement for democracy as I suppose as a means to an end, but also repression. Obviously, there's the heritage of Peterloo as well, where demonstrators calling for the vote, maybe not the 6 points of the Charter, but certainly the vote for working people were murdered in the streets. What are there other strands that you can discover in kind of the early 19th century that lead up to this point of the what was it called, promulgation of the People's Charter in the 30s?
Well, perhaps just to supplement the point about the repression against the working class, this was the norm, the brutal repression of the working class, and in any attempt to raise its voice or organize independently. Not just jail-ins, but transportation. It means he'd be sent to the penal colonies in Tasmania for several years. Many people didn't get there, because I think about 20% died on the journey. It was such an arduous journey, the rationing, the terrible conditions. And of course, the threat of capital punishment. People were hanged. They'd be hanged, drawn, and quartered was still on the books. And the ruling class wasn't a very nice, not very. The British ruling class was a very vicious ruling class, and were prepared to use any measures in order to defend their privileges and defend their class rule. Of course, Chartism was born out of struggles of the working class. I mean, there was a struggle for trade unionism, and they became revolutionary trade unions. They didn't make no bones about it. They were revolutionary trade unions in the early days. You had the Luddites who broke the machines because they were, through desperation, trying to prevent the unemployment and the cuts in wages, and they lashed out, if you like, in that way to try and to protect themselves and their families. There was a turn to democratic reforms to try to win the vote, to find a way out in that way. And of course, at Peterloo, the workers were cut down in cold blood. But you got different movements arising, you had the impact of the French Revolution, which it was like an impact of the Russian Revolution in the 20th century. The American War of Independence, all these things fed into the democratic, if you like, rights of the working class, what they needed to seize power, to take power with. And of course, the ideas of socialism were born in this country. The ideas of Robert Owen, who was the first British socialist, were ideas which filled the Chartist movement as well. First of all, Owen's great service was a condemnation of capitalism and the ills of capitalism, and offering a new way forward of a cooperative form of society where there was no private ownership. He was against private ownership. And these ideas of socialist ideas and gripped the minds, particularly the advanced workers in Britain. So everything fed in. The fight against the new poor law, the attempts of the government to force those that were in dire need and poverty into the workhouses. It's the only way they could get any form of relief was to work in a workhouse, so breaking up stones and goodness knows what, making sewing oakum and on the treadmills and so on, of these horrendous places. And there were movements again, mass movements were burnt down in the Midlands, in the north. They burnt down the workhouses. These were mass movements, not like half a dozen people. Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were involved in a struggle at this stage over different things, which began to coalesce in these ideas of Chartism.
And to be honest, the struggle against the workhouse reminds me a lot about of the struggle against austerity today. In many ways, the austerity cuts against the working class are trying to make kind of being out of work and having to turn to benefits or any kind of support, actually a fate worse than death in some respects. And you see the desperation. So in that respect, there's a great deal of relevance in this period. I wanted also to talk.
If I just interrupt, you have the Victorian idea of the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. That's the whole point. And the measures they took were, well, you saw it you read Oliver Twist, sorry, wrong character, Dickens, and you could see in there the monstrous conditions that the working class and the poor sections lived under at that time, and that's what produced the revolt in the working class. That's produced the changing consciousness of the working class.
And I wanted to talk a bit more about the petition itself, and well, the charter itself. You mentioned 6 points of the charter, and you mentioned in the book that Engels said that behind that these 6 points, kind of as purely democratic as they seem on the surface, would be sufficient to overthrow the monarchy, the House of Lords, basically an entire British state. So I think it would be good to maybe spend a bit more time on these. First of all, what were the 6 points? So one of them was a vote for all men over 21. Of sound mind and not in punishment for a crime. So in some ways, actually relatively backwards to what we have now, but by the standards of the time, a revolutionary demand.
That's right. He had the right to vote. He had the question of a secret ballot, of payment of MPs, abolition of the property qualification for MPs, so equal electoral districts or constituencies, and also annual parliaments. That's the one they refused to implement, and that was the most dangerous from their point of view. They could live with the others because they had the means of manipulating public opinion. That was later on, but of course they fought against these demands. Why? Because of the pressures that exerted behind them, what stood behind them. And the ruling class knew they feared Chartism like they feared Bolshevism in the 20th century. Why? Because they feared revolution, because they knew that the Chartist movement wasn't a movement that was going to be placated with a few reforms here and there. It was a building up of millions of workers who were demanding a fundamental change to their working conditions and to their lives. And that posed a direct threat to the ruling class. And that's what they were terrified of, quite rightly so, because that's how the working class learned through these events, and through these struggles and this experience, they came to the realization then that capitalism, that the existence of that form of society they lived under, was the problem that had to be done away with, and a rational form of society created in its place.
And so, you see these 6 demands, but all the context that you've just talked about briefly is swelling behind it. So you see this kind of mass power of the movement. In terms of one thing that I wanted to clear up is another thing that's very famous about Chartism, we're taught about if we're taught about anything to do with Chartism, is that it took the form of a series of petitions to Parliament, rolls of signatures petitioning for the charter, People's Charter, the 6 points, to become the law of the land. Now, those methods in themselves don't necessarily scream revolution. And of course, the Parliament rejected those petitions. In what way can you call this movement of presenting big petitions revolutionary?
Well, of course, the idea of a petition has been there for a long time in British history, as in other countries. But the Chartists adopted this tactic and applied it in such a way as they'd never been applied before. The other petitions were generally local petitions about this or that problem, this or that issue. Now they took up, if you like, the demands of power, in a sense, posing political power. And this petition wouldn't be a local petition. It would be the first time we have a national petition. So it was used as a means of going into every town, every village, every hamlet, involving millions of workers, using this as a propaganda weapon to stir up and to galvanize the working class into struggle. So the petition was very the means, if you like, was very advanced, very revolutionary, brought into being, I would say, brought into activity millions of workers as a result. And of course, they looked to this idea. Well, here's the voice of the people. This is the voice of the masses. And yet you saw the way in which they were treated, but with contempt from a rotten parliament, a rotten regime, a rotten system. That's the way they looked upon it. And therefore, this petition was very valuable in mobilizing public opinion, the opinion of the working class against the system of society itself, and a focal point in which to galvanize the strength of this movement. which was quite incredible, a very heroic revolutionary movement, in my opinion.
Mm. And one point you draw out in the book is it wasn't just a petition. It wasn't a passive thing, almost like, you sign up to a change.org petition online, which has its purposes, but it wasn't quite like that. We're talking about mass assemblies of workers, and also the election of delegates who actually assembled in what they called a convention to kind of oversee the presentation of the petition. Would you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so look, this period was burning with class struggle, should we say? I think the Hammond said it was, when you read this period, it's like you're reading a period about civil war. That's the kind of class battles and struggle, class against class. They use the words of Ernest Jones, the Chartist leader. And we have to see the struggle in this kind of context. The movement, actually, the Chartist movement, it arose at the small meeting in London. And yet, from this very tiny meeting, it was like the spark that lit the flame, which caused a massive blaze, if you like. That was the whole thing. And they became a mass movement. They needed to mobilize the masses, and therefore they called these mass rallies, mass movements everywhere. And you're not talking about a 10,000 or a 50. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of workers being mobilized into these demonstrations. I know we look at the Corbyn movement in the past period, and even that, I think they would put the Corbyn movement into the shade. I mean, in Kersal Moor, near Manchester, I believe it is, the meeting they had was 500,000, 500,000 workers.
Wow.
Who came from the factories after work, women, children, their families, turned out. Of course, there's no microphones in those days, but these are held on hillsides, on the side of these hillsides, and the oratory was such as to win the masses to this revolutionary overturn in society. And through these mass meetings, they elected delegates to the convention, the Chartist convention. Of course, the word convention has a very revolutionary flavor to it, as with the French Revolution and the French Convention, and it was purposely chosen for that point of view. And delegates were elected from these mass meetings to this assembly. This describe it as a Labour Parliament or a workers' parliament. It was an alternative government in fact, which debated and discussed out the tactics and strategy of how to win the charter and how to change society. So yes, so it was a mass movement involving this central focal point of a convention, a leadership, if you like, of the working class, which debated the way forward to secure the aims of the charter itself. And these delegates had to go back to the mass meetings as well. You had this democracy that was there in the movement, and they could be changed if they're out the line or they weren't expressing the viewpoints of the masses sufficiently. So it was a very democratic movement, in that sense, and a very advanced movement, because within these conventions, they discussed, revolutionary tactics, revolutionary strategy that they'd never discussed before in British history. The question of power for the working class was posed for the first time ever, because they had this is a young virgin working class in Britain. They haven't got the conservative ideas, and baggage of the past, and they were prepared to look for any means that would secure their particular objectives. And of course, the ruling class were opposed to that, and they did everything that they could do in order to defend their privileges. So that's why I give it its revolutionary overtones and its character, and it questions things that had never been questioned before. And this is the change in consciousness that's taking place in the masses and in the leadership of the Chartist movement, and how they become, well, we know this debate between different trends within Chartism itself, between physical force Chartism and moral force Chartism as the way forward. So it was a workers' parliament to find the way forward.
I think this is really significant, because just to try and picture it, I mean, if you're saying that there were 500,000 people listening to a single speech at Kersal Moor, that's roughly the entire membership of the Labour Party in a single place, listening to one person talking about class against class war, effectively electing delegates to what you've described as a workers' parliament. I mean, with delegates actually being accountable to the masses as well. I mean, this sounds This sounds like the beginnings of workers' power, really, of dual power in the country even. And do you think that there is an analogy that can be drawn with, 1917, basically, in the All-Russian Congress of Soviets?
Yes, within Chartism, it's like an embryo of different movements, you know, of the working class, and they're feeling their way forward. And of course, that's why you get different parallels and similarities within other revolutionary tendencies and movements. But to give you the scale of it, you know, there's a quote by Fergus O'Connor, who was considered the main leader of Chartism. And he said he addressed about 1 million people in the space of a week or so in relation to the mass meetings that he had addressed. 1 million people, given the fact that the population as a whole was about 15 million. You can imagine the scope of Chartism that went, everywhere. It had its tentacles everywhere. It affected everyone. And that's why it became a real mass movement. Yes, the convention, the convention itself, it met the first time in the beginning of 1839, was certainly got parallels with like a Soviet, insofar as the working class tendencies are there, present, debating and discussing out the key questions of the day and how they can be achieved. And it's a remarkable, you listen to if you read about the debates that took place there, they're on an extremely high level. And people joined the movement, you know, they weren't careerists, you know, they weren't place seekers. People who joined the movement were dedicated to fight for the interests of working people. They were prepared to make the greatest sacrifices ever. And they connected with the working class. That's the point about it. And the more they connected, the more militant they became, the more they spoke to the workers, the more militant the workers became. It was like a dialectical process going on here of changing. The Chartist leaders urged the masses to be armed, to get arms. This is not going to be a tea party. They said you need arms to confront the British state. And they did arm, and the arms even in the mass meetings. I know that the Reverend who led Stevenson, who led the main demonstration towards Kersal Moor and spoke there. He called not just for the arming of the working class, but appealed to everybody there to fire their arms, you know, to discharge what they had. You know, what kind of arms have you got? He raised it, and they fired a few shots, and then they. He said, "Well, is that all you got?" And more. And then this was stirring up the ferment in the masses. They were responding to him. He was responding to them, and all the Chartist leaders were doing this. They were connecting with the real movement of the working class, a militant revolutionary movement in the working class, which were prepared
to. This raises quite an important point, I think. You mentioned earlier about moral force and physical force. Obviously, what you're describing here is part of the physical force wing. But why I think it's so important is that today in Britain, a picture of British workers, in this case English workers, further firing arms into the sky and basically threatening the government with, you know, forcible overthrow. It's completely alien to the picture of the British and particularly English working class that's painted. And something I've encountered, you know, friends, comrades in the movement who felt a certain like demoralization following the 2019 election results, saying, "Oh, is it something about, you know, that the French have this revolutionary tradition? Why is it the English are, you know, I don't know, so passive?" I think one thing that I found so inspiring about the book and about kind of what you're explaining here is that just completely, it does away with that. It exposes it as a complete fiction, because this is our history, isn't it? As British workers, and well, as workers generally, but as British workers, this is our history. One thing that I wanted to ask about in particular is you've talked about, you mentioned moral force and physical force. Could you briefly explain what the two different positions were? So presumably what united them was both wanted the People's Charter to become law of the land. That's why they were in the same movement. But what divided them? And what was the balance of, you know, the relationship of forces between those two camps?
Well, originally, as I said, the Chartist movement started off in a very small way. And those who dominated it at that time, we could consider were moral force Chartists. So they believed that you could persuade people and persuade the government through moral persuasion, through argument and so on and so forth. And if you like, they were a bit of, if you want to put it that way, a bit of a reformist wing, gradually, although I would say they were far great. They had more courage than today's reformists. I think they're on a different level. But nevertheless, that's the kind of idea. The idea of persuading people to change their minds and so on and so forth, and cool down the language. You don't need all this rhetoric and so on and so forth. And they hoped that they could, through those means, they could persuade the ruling class in order to introduce these particular measures. On the other hand, you had the physical force charges, which grew in number with the growth of the movement itself. As the movement grew into a mass movement of working class people in the North Wales, everywhere else, then it took on a far more revolutionary connotation, and with it, the domination of the physical force Chartist wing. And they had their language is very violent. They didn't believe in of course, their argument was for the working class. Their argument was to persuade the working class to challenge for power. They would present the petition, but they didn't have much faith that the ruling class in Britain were going to grant those concessions. And therefore they said, well, if they don't grant, then what are we going to do? Are we just going to sit back and just talk about it? And they said, no, we need to challenge them, even with force of arms if need be, in order to ensure that the charter is successful. And these two wings, if you like, this physical force Chartists became much more powerful as events. Within a relatively short period of time, they became the dominant force of the movement. But they did unite the movement under the slogan of peaceably, if we may, forcibly, if we must. And that kind of, you could read into that whatever you wanted to, and that's what happened. But there's clearly, the more the proletarian base of the party grew, of Chartism grew, the more physical force Chartism dominated the whole scene. In other words, the revolutionary side, if you like, as opposed to reformism, it was a revolutionary side, a proletarian side that dominated Chartism. And that's the thing is buried completely. Yeah. By the histories, the so-called histories, which I don't want to mention this, and where they talk about revolution, well, it didn't happen. It was utopian then, and by reference, it's utopian now. That's the basic guide. Rather than understanding there was a revolutionary movement, why did it fail? And there are lessons to be learned in order to be a successful revolution for the future. That's the way you should look at it. But no, for them, it's out of the question. But
so you mentioned lessons, and you mentioned that although by the summer of 1839, the physical force Chartists were basically in charge, and this is a movement of certainly over 1 million people who signed this petition. And yet you don't see, the charter doesn't become law of the land, and you don't see the successful overturn of the British state. And I suppose it's a bit of a big question as to why did all this happen. But with the convention specifically, the petition was, of course, rejected by Parliament, which probably came as a surprise to nobody. What happened next? Did they try to launch an attempt to overturn the government, or what?
Well, they at this time they discussed what should be done, and if you like, the left wing of the movement put forward the idea that there needed to be an insurrection against the government. You couldn't. There was no way out. They weren't going to grant anything. There had to be an armed insurrection against the British government and the overthrow of the British state. Is the only way of securing the charter. And very quickly, the moral force charters, many from Birmingham, resigned at this stage. Not all of them, but a large portion of them resigned. And the debate in the convention was about the means. A general strike was the first one, and this idea had been born in Britain in the 1830s. It arose particularly from a man called William Benbow, who for the first time raised this idea of, because capitalism emerged in Britain for the first time. There was a new working class, the first working class in the world, and therefore these ideas were new. A general strike was new, and it was raised in a sort of peculiar way. The idea of a holy month, let's go on strike for a whole month, and that should be sufficient to collapse the regime. And these ideas were vividly discussed and supported. And that's the point, they were supported. The idea of a general strike in 1839 was supported by the Assembly, by the Convention. And the others were on the left wing, like a man called Julian Harney, believed, that there should be a strategy. They could use democratic means. They could even stand in the general election. General elections were called in Britain. Of course, they were a sideshow because it's a handful of people voting for a handful of people. But in the actual general election itself, where there was hustings and meetings and so on, you were able to put forward your own candidates. And the Chartists, they said that the Chartists should put forward our candidates. And everywhere they did this, they won by a show of hands. But the thing is, the people who came there didn't have the vote. They came, and you're not talking about 10 people or 15 people. Thousands of people, tens of thousands of people came to these meetings. And they could vote with their hands, a show of hands. But of course, it didn't count because they didn't have the real vote. And therefore, those who were defeated, that is the Liberals and the Tory candidates, would say, we want the official vote now. We've done this. We want to, and they would get the official vote. They would get elected. But the idea was they should win their votes all over the country, and they should march on London. There should be 1 million people in London marching on London. They compared it like the sans-culottes in the French Revolution. It used to be led by an armed force of Chartists involving 1 million people marching on Parliament. And if Parliament didn't disperse, then they should be caught and thrown into the Thames. That was their idea. But these are the vivid ideas. But they supported a general strike. But unfortunately, it didn't work out in practice. There was confusion in the Chartist leadership, and there were some people who opposed it. That there was a lot of toing and froing and so on. And as a result, in 1839, there was supposed to be a general strike, but for the 12th of August it was called for. But this was basically called off and made into a 2-day strike, which didn't affect anything really. It didn't make any difference. But and it was a bit of a letdown, and people started to draw radical conclusions. If a general strike is not going to be called, then we got to take things into our own hands. And the idea of an insurrection was born under those circumstances.
Right, and of course there was an attempted insurrection in 1839 as well. In November, we're approaching another anniversary of the famous Newport Rising. And so was this? Sometimes it's difficult looking at it to see whether this was the thwarted beginning of a nationwide insurrection or just an expression of frustration after a defeat. Do you think it's possible to choose between those things, or do you think it's a combination of both? And first of all, what happened in Newport for people who aren't familiar, very briefly?
Well, in Newport on the 3rd of November, there was an attempted insurrection. Well, there was an insurrection. It involved about 30,000 colliers and steel workers, iron workers, who marched to seize the town of Newport. And Newport was a very important sort of hub, if you like, for industry and trade and so on at that time. But the main aim was to secure the release of a Chartist leader, of Henry Vincent, who'd been arrested. He was a key leader of the Welsh Chartists. And he was arrested and imprisoned in Newport prison. And therefore, the plan was that the plan was to seize the town, release him, but it would be the spark for a national insurrection to overthrow the government. That's the essence of it. And there were plans afoot in other areas in Derbyshire, in Yorkshire, in order to carry through revolutionary insurrections in these particular areas too. But the plans obviously were kept secret because the movement was penetrated by all sorts of informers and spies and so on and so forth. And the government was prepared to use these kind of methods to arrest people and imprison them. So they tried to keep it as much as possible under wraps. But at the same time, yes, this was the first major armed confrontation with the British state, the biggest confrontation, I would say, on home soil of the British government. It's an incredible movement. It was defeated. There was tactics that they employed. Was really, I don't want to go the ins and outs. It's very difficult the ins and outs given the time we've got. But they tried to release certain Chartists who've been arrested in the Westgate Hotel in the centre of Newport. But they had troops waiting on, and they opened fire on the demonstrators, on the Chartists, and they killed, I think, 22 of them, most probably like to have died. And they should have waited really and prepared the ground more, probably, if you were from a tactical point of view. But they rushed us to release their comrades who had been arrested.
I suppose you say that this was basically the first time this had been tried. They had nothing to go on.
Yes.
They were pioneers, weren't they? They were trying to overthrow the first capitalist state in history, the first time ever. So I guess in hindsight we can see these mistakes, but it must have been really impossible to penetrate that fog at the time and give them that credit.
Yes, I mean, like you could say the Chartists were giants insofar as they were the pioneers. They had little to go on. Of course, behind them they had the French Revolution and the American Revolution. But as far as the workers' revolution was concerned, there was no precedent at all, and they were feeling their way forward, and they took very bold steps. That's the point about it. They did get quite close, I would say. And you look at the writings of the ruling class of the period; they were terrified that there would be a successful revolution in Britain at that time, and they mobilized the military against the workers. And they mobilized the state apparatus, particularly against the workers at every point. But the workers fought back in an extremely courageous fashion. And the leaders, they had faults, and I could say that. But good God, they had courage, they had the land, they had the guts to carry through a measure of this nature. It's a pity that some of the, I would say, some of the present day Labour leaders could do with a bit of the fire, if you like, of the Chartists. And clearly they meant business, but unfortunately they didn't have a completely worked out strategy or idea. They didn't know how to use the potential they had in their hands to carry it through to a conclusion. That was the sad point about it. But they tried and tried.
Yeah, and they tried again. There was, we don't really have time to go into it in detail, but you already brought up this question of the general strike. Okay, it didn't happen in 1839, but effectively a national political general strike did take place in 1842, didn't it? That it became known as the Plug Plot. And I sometimes the way people treat this when it is talked about is it was kind of just an accident, really, or that it was about wages. Would you agree with that assessment, or do you see this as a strike for the Charter?
Well, no, it's a very important episode in the history of Chartism. And what happened was that the Chartists were conducting a lot of propaganda in the factory areas and so on and so forth, particularly in Manchester and around the Manchester area. And many were Chartists. It was a mass movement. But of course, the initial, spark for the movement was a cut of 25% in wages of the cotton workers. And that was the first the outbreak of the strike.
Right.
But very quickly, when they, very, very quickly, I mean, literally, as they marched out of the gates, they cheered for the Charter, for Fergus O'Connor, the leader of Chartism, of the Northern Star, the Chartist paper. It was a Chartist general strike. There's no two ways about it. But it did come from below. But it had been also fed into by the Chartist propaganda itself of the time. And of all the main speakers, I think the recorded speakers, about 45, 46 recorded speeches at the time. Every single one of them, apart from two, were given by Chartists.
Right.
And when the workers came together in these mass strike meetings, they pledged themselves to the Charter. When there was a workers' or trade union conference called in Manchester of the trades, they debated what was the real aim of the strike. And the vast majority, there was a strike to bring about the Charter. Of course, they're in favour of wage increases as well. But the Charter, that was it.
It's worth pointing out, isn't it, as you've already explained, that to say we're going out on strike indefinitely for the Charter doesn't simply mean we'd like the vote. This is basically a strike for workers' power, isn't it? This is a strike to change the state and basically introduce workers' democracy and workers' control over society.
Well, workers learn through experience, and a strike itself is an embryo revolution, isn't it? In effect, workers don't go to work. This is not the normal situation, and not only that, it was a strike that spread. It spread throughout the whole of Manchester, Lancashire, went up to Scotland, down into Wales, down into Cornwall. It was a political strike. This was an incredible event, the first general strike in the history of the working class, a political general strike. And they learned, as you would find, in the base, every single day, the workers were learning and feeling their power. And they set up committees, and the committees were able to decide what work was going to be done, what wasn't going to be done. Employers had to come to the committee to ask what rights they had and what they didn't have and what they could do and what they couldn't do. This was workers' power in action, and as a matter of fact, the basis, if it had been pulled together, yes, of a worker state. But that's the end. If like, everything is in embryo, it's the embryo is the development. What you needed is to be linked up nationally, and the Chartist leaders needed to play a key role. But like, even they didn't fully understand. They didn't call the strike. They didn't fully appreciate. They give it support. It is true, but they didn't really fully understand what was in their hands, the potential in their hands, and therefore, without the, it can't go on forever. People are going to be starved back for work to work. And an opportunity which could have been there, it was there for the taking, was missed, unfortunately. Again, it's because of the naivety. I mean, Marxism wasn't around then. Scientific socialism wasn't around then. They were feeling their way. Yeah. They did very well, but they didn't go far enough. We have to understand that. But it showed the potential that was there. The potential movement of the British working class to carry out a revolution was certainly there in 1842. There's no two ways about that.
Now, you mentioned Marxism wasn't there. And yeah, as you've already said, Chartism predates Marxism, well, at least for the most part. So just briefly, and this is we're already running out of time. So just this is kind of the last kind of thought that I'd like us to explore before we sadly have to end the podcast. What is the relationship between Chartism and Marxism? Are they basically just two discrete blocks in the movement, or is there an interconnection between the two?
Well, look, firstly, Marxism is a science, and you could say that Marxism was a combination of the best ideas, the most brilliant ideas of the time. We came from German philosophy, British bourgeois economics, classical economics, and French socialism. Those are the three roots, if you like, of Marxism. But on top of that, you must say that Marxism is a development from the experience of the working class itself. Marx developed his ideas on the state, for instance, with an understanding of what happened in France in the Commune of 1871. Engels was a Chartist. Engels was here in 1843, met with the Chartist leaders. He joined the Chartist movement. He wrote a book on the conditions of the working class in England in 1844. He observed how the working class moved, how it developed, how consciousness changed in the working class. And then with those things, you drew lessons from that, which is Marxism. Marxism draws out the lessons into theory and understanding, not just from one episode, but from all over. But nevertheless, Chartism at that stage was a real, a school for the working class, and therefore it was a very rich experience for Marx and Engels, who gave support to the Chartist movement and hoped to guide the chart, which he did through their connections with Julian Harney and Ernest Jones, which became the leaders of the movement. They gave it a very revolutionary socialist outlook. Unfortunately, this was about 1850, where you had the decline of Chartism. That's the point, and the emergence and development of British capitalism, which cut across the entire process. But nevertheless, it just showed that that Marxism was able to connect with the key layers of the Chartist movement. They learned from it. After all, Julian Harney published the Communist Manifesto in his paper, the Red Republican, in 1850. Many conversations, and it was in solidarity with the International and so on and so forth. And therefore, there are, yes, lessons to be learned. The British workers instinctively came very close to Marxism. The labour theory of value, the class struggle, the nature of the state, and so on. All these things were being drawn in Britain at this particular time. It was about a cordon for these ideas, a school for these ideas. And therefore, this helped, of course, Marx and Engels to refine and develop their ideas as well. There's no doubt about it. So rather than saying, Marxism is alien to Britain and, foreign creed and all the rest, which is not the nonsense, it actually, many of the elements were born in the British experience, as a matter of fact. And therefore, and what we should understand is that Chartism was a tremendous revolutionary movement. But what it really lacked was that scientific, if you like, program of Marxism to guide it through to its logical conclusion. It came too late. And therefore, we could say that we stand on the shoulders of the great pioneers of the Chartist movement, no doubt about it, all their revolutionary traditions and initiatives. But Marxism gives us that extra edge in which to learn the lessons and be able to understand how to carry through and bring about the fundamental change of society that the Chartists wanted. In other words, socialism in Britain and socialism internationally.
Well, thanks very much, Rob. I think that this is an appropriate and inspiring place to finish. Sadly, we have to finish anyway for lack of time. But it sounds to me like there are a lot of lessons contained in this experience of Chartism and in the book itself. And I would certainly urge, I've had the opportunity to read it, and I certainly recommend any labour movement activist in this country, certainly any Marxist in this country and abroad, get a copy. You can get a copy for £12 now from Wellred, and give it a read, because I think there's a lot of experiences and lessons buried in that we need to unearth and reintroduce into the labour movement. So I hope you've all enjoyed the podcast. We're going to have to leave you now, but until next time, see you later.